your work, and where we might go from here with the project with the class. Welcome to the class.
Thank you. It's good to be a part of the class. My name is Farooq Ullah. I am the executive director of an organization called Stakeholder Forum for a Sustainable Future, or just Stakeholder Forum for short. Our mission is to advance sustainable development at the global levels, which we do through good governance and participatory decision making. So what that means in very much more plain language is helping those who have a stake in the decisions that are being made in their name at the global level be more involved in shaping those decisions and creating the outcomes. The theory, of course, behind that is the more participatory, the more inclusive these decision-making processes are, the better the outcomes will be in return. As you, I'm sure, are very well aware, the UN is a very, very highly political space, which therefore creates all sorts of navigational issues for stakeholders hoping to be a part of it, either because there is certain blockages for politics where governments want to talk about things behind closed doors and in private, or in more extreme cases, they actually might object to a NGO or a not-for-profit actually being part of that discussion because of their political affiliations back at the domestic level. So it's a complex field, but I firmly believe that it is the way forward. This idea of greater democracy in our decision-making is essential. So Paul, you want to guide me through this? What would you like me to do next year?
Yeah, we're going to just talk through your presentation. You all have Farooq's PowerPoint that is in your resource folder. Farooq and I decided that was better than ultimately him hiding behind the desktop. So if you want to bring that up, he'll talk you through the presentation. Let's just wait and see. Let him pull it up, and when we know it's up, we'll resume. Okay, Farooq?
Okay, well, I'm ready to go, but I have to look at my PowerPoint instead of looking at myself. So
that's okay.
you have to forgive me if I start giving the screen funny looks whilst I go through this.
Okay.
Okay, so the purpose of this...
We all set? In terms of the presentation, just 1 second.
Okay.
Oh, that's what it is. Yeah, okay. I got 2 mics, you guys. It's me and... Okay, so are we all set here? Is the document out for all of you? Okay, we're good to go, Farooq.
Great. Okay. So you have in front of you the presentation. I'm not going to go through every line, but just very quickly before we begin, by way of show of hands, can I ask how many people have heard of the Rio+20 UN Conference on Sustainable Development? Good, excellent. And how many people have heard of these new things being put forward called the SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goals? Okay, well, excellent. I think at least you guys are very well aware of then what's happened. It will make this a bit easier and quicker. So the first slide then, it answers a very basic question that I think we all get asked a lot everywhere we go, and that is whether Rio+20 was a success or failure. In the immediate aftermath of the conference, many of the NGOs and not-for-profits around the world really panned Rio+20 as a complete failure. It didn't really achieve anything, and there were no really discrete outcomes. But in truth, I think that's a bit of a simplistic and reductive answer, and we really need to dig a little deeper to understand the true answer and the fact that it's far more nuanced. There were many successes and there were many failures, and they all need to be itemized and treated separately. But really, the fact of the matter is that Rio+20 was not an endpoint. It was the beginning of new processes, and it is those processes that we're in the middle of right now. And whether we can turn those processes into successes will determine whether Rio+20 was itself a success. So really the answer is a little more complex, but also the answer requires us now to really dig deep and try harder and redouble our efforts in trying to secure bold and ambitious outcomes to these processes that we're in now, one of which, of course, is the creation of these new Sustainable Development Goals as the successor framework to the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, which were created in 2000. So really the answer is that time will be the truest judge of whether Rio+20 was a success, but we all know, sadly, that time is not something we have an abundance of, and we are essentially sitting on a socio-ecological time bomb. So whilst we need to get these things right, and therefore take our time in doing so, we also need to be acting in a much more swift manner. So then that leads us on to the next slide of the presentation, which is understanding a bit more about what is this thing, the post-2015 development agenda, and what are these things called the Sustainable Development Goals. Coming up in the new development agenda is an urgent priority for the international community, not least because, of course, the Millennium Development Goals expire this year, and we need to think about what we are doing next. What is the framework for action that we are pursuing? But at the same time, find better ways to deal with some of the unresolved systemic issues that the MDGs do not address. Essentially, the MDGs are partially a flawed system in the sense that they treat the symptoms of poverty rather than the drivers of poverty. And in that sense, it's mechanically flawed in the sense that we are throwing money at a problem of our own creation. And we need to look a little deeper and come up with a much more systems-based approach to look at these issues and understand why these problems are being created and then address them from a much more holistic approach, which is exactly what the concept of sustainable development asks us to do.
If I interrupt, that is communication challenge number one, what Farooq just said.
Yes, I agree. And that's a huge challenge. I mean, we don't communicate what sustainable development is about and what it's trying to achieve very well. Partially, that's because it's very, very hard to do. And that's partially true because essentially sustainable development is a very broad agenda. I used to work with a fellow a few years ago at an old job. He had a joke. He used to say sustainable development is about three things: everything, everything, and everything. And it's true. I mean, it's if you do it right, you should be looking at things in that holistic systems-based way. And therefore, you have to take into account everything. But then that's hard to communicate. And moving on. Of course, we must draw on lessons from the past. We need to understand what worked for the MDGs and what didn't. But at the same time, we need to tackle these interconnected global challenges of climate change, resource scarcity, good governance, resilience, and equalities. And central to this bigger thing called the post-2015 development agenda is a set of goals, the SDGs. So we'll have a bigger narrative in which sits the goals. I'll come back to that point shortly because it's a very important nuance. The goals are very much about what we are going to do, but not so much about the how. And the how has to come up separately in what we call the means of implementation, or MOI in UN speak. And that's what they're debating right now in New York about how we actually do these goals. We've got essentially the draft goals in place. But ultimately, the aim of the...
1 second. The what and the how. That's an example of two sort of different approaches to the project, essentially to the communication strategy. Essentially addressing how this work gets done for the communication, wherein essentially sort of the B2B model versus the what of sustainability, and then how the sustainability goals within the infrastructure get communicated and a level of congruence gets achieved. Two different projects.
Agreed.
Okay.
Ultimately, the aim of the SDGs is to eradicate poverty, that is globally, poverty in all its forms everywhere, is what they say, through sustainable development. And that itself is an exciting shift. And we have to understand slightly, before we move on, and particularly from a communications angle, the more subtle difference between the MDG era and now the new SDG era. So if we go to the next slide, MDGs versus SDGs, we'll begin to look at several important and fundamental differences between the two goals frameworks. In the first instance, this is very much, at least at the rhetorical level, a shift from economic to sustainable development as the answer to the poverty problem. The MDGs were really predicated on this idea that economic growth could lift all people out of poverty. Whereas now, of course, everything I've said earlier did not necessarily addressing the root causes. The sustainable development goals are much more holistic, and they look at these things. That's the second point, the second difference. There's a greater focus on the root causes of poverty. For example, environmental degradation, growing inequalities, and poor or lack of governance. Those things were not covered in the MDGs, where they are with these new goals. And that's, those two things together, very, very important to get that message across, because that's a difference of ideology. It's a shifting of ideology from an old era, some might say the Washington Consensus era of the 90s and 2000s, to hopefully something that's a little more progressive. But the challenge, of course, is that's the rhetoric. We now need to match it with true action. The third crucial difference that I like to identify is that whilst the MDGs apply only to developing countries, the SDGs are going to be global in nature and universal application, which means that they also apply to developed countries. So the new goals will be universal, applying both to developed and developing countries. The answer is, however, the question then becomes is how do they apply? Are they applied equally? What's the ratio? And nobody really knows that answer yet. In fact, we, Stakeholder Forum, are writing a paper on that right now, trying to understand the implications of universality for developed countries. The universality dimension is very, very important because it means that we're all in this together, but also that we have very different approaches to dealing with the problem. And given the challenges that we face nationally, we have to think about approaching the delivery of these goals in slightly different ways. But we all have a duty now to do something. It isn't just the old era of handing money to developed countries through overseas development aid and saying, you guys sort your problems out and we'll just continue existing the way we do.
Excellent. Could we see that paper, Farooq? Will that be done within the time frame of this semester?
Oh, well, yes. I mean, it's been a while since I've been in university, but I presume the semester ends in around April.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, well, this paper should be done by the end of February. So.
Oh, okay, great. And would you be able to make it available to the working group on your project?
Yeah, of course. In fact, if timing it requires, we can even sort of send a draft version before it's published, because it might be that's going to be a very, very important challenge of the whole framework, is what communication-wise, in terms of helping people understand that we all have to do something. We all need to take domestic action now.
Because one thing we could do, maybe even, I don't know, it'll depend on the team, is actually work with you on that particular paper from the draft to iteration itself, if that's something that you and the members of the group ultimately feel is reasonable and serves your ends.
Yeah, that would be great, actually. It would be an amazing resource to sort of have some people test these things out. But let's come back to that and see what we can do.
Sure, okay.
So the next question becomes one of process and understanding where exactly we are now and what's happening next. And ultimately, in the most simplistic sense, I divide this process into two stages. The first is the design stage, which is essentially what we're in right now, which is trying to come up with the goals as well as this aspect of the means of implementation I mentioned. That ends in September 2015 in New York, where heads of states from around the world will gather at the opening of the General Assembly of the UN to sign off these goals and put them into force. So we have between now and September for the design stage. And so it's going to get very, very hectic in New York as we reach the deadline, because there's a very long way to go, I have to be honest. Then that links into the delivery stage, which, as I mentioned, is for both developing and developed countries alike. And that begins on the 1st of January 2016. So we need very clearly to think a bit about what any activity, for whether it's academia or stakeholders or even government, how they align their activities to these two stages. The truth of the matter is, whilst the attention around these goals will increase dramatically in the run-up to the summit, the ability to affect the design dramatically reduces. So it's kind of an inverse relationship. As media and the public becomes interested, their ability to actually influence the goals themselves goes downward dramatically. So in many ways, thinking about the delivery side of things is much more important now and can have a much bigger impact. So moving on, I want to talk a bit about this concept, this principle of universality that we're holding up. We, Stakeholder Forum, are kind of putting it forward as our definition as a triangle of universality, which has sort of three different dimensions. It asks whether the goal or targets are applicable to developed countries, whether they're implementable in developed countries, and whether they are transformational in developed countries. The first, applicable, is sort of is it relevant? The second, implementability, is can it be done? And the third one, transformational, really asks the question of does it really matter? Will it have an impact? So this is the basis for the paper we're working on right now, and we're going through the entire goal and target framework and scoring them against these dimensions. So there's currently 17 goals and there's 169 targets. So the framework is goal, target, and indicators. We haven't begun yet working on the indicators yet. So moving on, the next slide talks a bit about this need for what I call vertical alignment, which is trying to understand again the link between the design side and delivery side. And when it comes to sustainable development, particularly international sustainable development, the point at which we commonly fall flat on our face is when we get to implementation. It's not easy to do. It's easy to decide what we want to do, i.e. what the goals are, but the how is always something that's essentially eluded us, at least on a true mass scale. So we need to think very, very carefully now about how these things link up. If we're having a vision, that is the post-2015 development agenda, we've got goals, which are the SDGs, how are we going to have strategies for delivery down at the regional and national levels, and how are we going to do on-the-ground implementation? But crucially also, the red arrow along the side is important because that's the feedback, and that's what we call monitoring and review. And that needs to be designed as well. So how are we going to understand how progress is being achieved against these goals down to that very nitty-gritty local level, but then also be able to roll all that information up and report it back to the global level? And that's a huge challenge. In fact, there is something very commonly known as the data challenge behind this. In most cases, we don't either have the indicators or the data collection systems to gather this information yet. So we have a long way to go, and not very long before we begin to deliver, to really think about these deeper issues about implementation and understanding progress. The last slide, very quickly, and then we can maybe open it up to a deeper chat, is understanding the role of the stakeholders in all of this. So crucially and importantly, the United Nations is a membership organization of governments, i.e. countries. There's 193 of them. That is the system we chose to build after World War II to avoid the atrocities of that war being repeated. So it's really the member states, well, it is entirely the member states who make the decisions. They vote. However, there is roles of stakeholders throughout all of that to help them come up with the best decisions, as I mentioned. And in the design stage, there are two very clear ones, of course: A, offering expert input, and B, holding governments to account and raising the ambition for a progressive outcome. So in the first one, I think it's important to note that in many cases, these people, the ones doing the negotiations, are career diplomats. They are not necessarily experts in the field of sustainable development or any of its subsets. And they need some help. They need experts helping them understand what is the right and good thing to do. How can they put it into place in a policy framework such as this? The second point about raising ambition, we need, of course, to keep the pressure on, raise attention of the fact that we are in the process of coming up with new goals for humanity's future. Maybe 0.01% of the population know about it. The more people are aware of it, the greater the pressure on governments to come away with a successful and ambitious deal. On the delivery side of things, of course, stakeholders have a clear role in implementation. I think it's important at this point to distinguish the fact that we, Stakeholder Forum, take a multi-stakeholder approach. Therefore, when I say stakeholders, I don't just mean civil society or not-for-profits. I also mean business and private sector. They are a stakeholder, and they will be crucial in the delivery of these things. I think that's another interesting communication challenge for us to consider. How do we try to get away from this 1960s, 1970s civil society mentality of us against them, and see the private sector not as necessarily always the enemy. And of course, they are a big part of the problem, but they are also a huge part of the solution. The next aspect where stakeholders can have a big part is on the monitoring review. I mentioned the data problems. We're going to need stakeholders themselves to help even collect the data in the first place. We need farmers in Africa to tell us how things are happening in terms of the ability to produce food, etc.
Okay,
and lastly, on the accountability element, it's our job, stakeholders, to hold governments to account for their agreements. These goals are not legally binding at the international level. And therefore, they're entirely voluntary. Therefore, this form of accountability cannot be enforced via legal mechanisms at the international level. So we will have to sort of do it ourselves, and it's voluntary accountability. So maybe I'll leave it there. Questions?
Okay, any questions for Farooq? Quiet here. Samara, introduce yourself, please.
Oh, yeah. Hi, I'm Samira.
I'm falling down the job, sorry. Keep going.
Hi, Farooq. Thank you for speaking with us. I'm Samira. I'm curious as to how stakeholder forum also keep track of progress and success in promoting stakeholders.
It's a good question. I think that accountability is one area that we're really trying to beef up our work on. So one clear example is we produce something roughly annually called Real Promises. So looking at the 14 commitments that were made in Rio Plus 20 in the outcome document, the 14 major ones, we annually try to give stakeholders a snapshot of progress on that. So if you go to our website and look for the Real Promises report, you can see the old one. The new one is about to be launched probably sometime in early February, which will be much more of an updated picture. If you're interested, I can send you a draft version if you want to keep it to yourselves until the publication has come out, and it'll be undesigned. But it's a useful summary of what has happened since the Rio Plus 20 outcome document was agreed in terms of these different processes that I mentioned that Rio Plus 20 started. And it isn't just the SDGs, there are 13 other things going on, and I won't bore you with the details now. But I think in general, we have to be much better at it. I think that quite often I find governments in the sort of drive for transparency just publish a lot of data, and they just put it up on websites and say, well, look, all the information is there. All you need to do is go analyze it yourself, make sense of it, and then do with it whatever you will with it. And I don't think that's sufficient. That's not proper accountability. That might be transparency, but it's not accountability. And I think that you need to have ways to analyze, to communicate, to repackage this information to help people understand, because obviously most people don't have time to by themselves go directly to government data and analyze it. I think bodies that are independent, like Stakeholder Forum, doing it on behalf of people and helping communicate it is therefore all the more important, because at the end of the day, reams of data don't make the news in terms of stories that people read. So trying to get it into a clear communicable form which is easy to understand and helps people really clearly see what's going on is a key to holding governments to account on their commitments.
Excellent. We have time for one more very brief question. Anyone? Okay, great. Farooq, thank you very much for your time. I know
Pleasure.
Honor is setting this all up and rehearsing all of this. And it involved a time commitment on your part, which we're grateful for.
Well, I'm happy to help, and please give my email address to anybody if they want to follow up. They can just email me directly, and I'll try to get back as quickly as I can. And then, of course, hopefully we can do this again in some other ways.
Yes, well, the team will be constituted by Monday, and
okay.
The team will be in touch with you Monday, Tuesday latest, and there'll be one more brief session with you, if we could, before class on Thursday, where they'll be essentially pitching to the class and to me 3 different possible ways to go and projects that would be of benefit to you and would serve the pedagogical goals of the class.
Okay, that would be great. Yeah, I mean, off the top of my head, I can just say we've identified a few things that's worth repeating now. This aspect of universality, how do we communicate this new challenge that everyone's in it together? This concept of accountability, trying to help communicate progress in a way that people on the street can clearly understand and use as a tool to hold their governments to account. And then, of course, the third aspect was this implementation challenge, trying to get more people involved, raise awareness, and also do the work. Those are all huge challenges which, quite frankly, in sustainable development, no one has really cracked those particular issues. I think something really kind of interesting and creative from this group could actually have a big real-world impact.
Thank you. I'm tripping over myself here. All right, great. Okay, if there's no other questions, we'll move on. Thank you, Farooq. We'll be in touch.
Okay, everyone have a good day. I'm off home now. Have a good night. Bye.
Bye. Okay, next up is Paul DeSenker from the UNF